The moment Flight 447 struggled to lift off the runway, Captain Sarah knew someone had made a deadly mistake that could kill everyone on board. But she had only minutes to figure out how to save 52 lives, including a newlywed couple on their dream honeymoon. Let us know from where you are watching from in the comment below, and subscribe to our channel for more heart-stopping aviation stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Sarah's hands gripped the controls as she watched the Boeing 737 fight against gravity, the engines screaming at maximum power yet barely managing to climb, and her heart sank when she realized they were carrying far too much weight for a safe flight. Her co-pilot Jake Peterson was frantically checking the cargo manifest on his tablet, his face growing whiter by the second as he calculated numbers that should never have been allowed on any aircraft. "Sarah, this can't be right," Jake whispered, his voice shaking as he showed her the weight calculations that revealed they were overloaded by nearly 8,000 pounds. In the passenger cabin behind them, bride Emma Rodriguez sat in her white traveling dress, still glowing from yesterday's wedding ceremony, completely unaware that her honeymoon flight had just become a fight for survival. She squeezed her new husband Marcus's hand and smiled, dreaming about the beach resort in Maui where they would spend the next week as husband and wife. Marcus noticed the unusual engine sounds first, the way they seemed to be working much harder than normal, but he didn't want to worry Emma on what was supposed to be the happiest time of their lives. 3 rows behind the newlyweds, Jessica Walsh, Emma's maid of honor and a terrified flyer on the best of days, was already gripping her armrests as she felt the aircraft's strange vibrations. The plane didn't feel right to her, didn't sound right, and every instinct in her body was screaming that something was wrong. She looked around the cabin and noticed other passengers were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats, their conversations becoming quieter as they too began to sense that this wasn't a normal flight. Near the back of the plane, retired airline pilot Frank Morrison was reading a book when the unusual flight characteristics caught his attention. In his 30 years of flying commercial aircraft, Frank had never felt a takeoff quite like this. And the sick feeling growing in his stomach told him the crew was dealing with something serious. He watched the flight attendants carefully, noting the slight tension in their movements, the way they avoided making direct eye contact with passengers who were starting to ask questions. Flight attendant Maria Santos had been flying for 12 years, but she had never experienced anything like this. The captain's briefing before takeoff had been routine, nothing to suggest the nightmare that was now unfolding at 15,000 feet. She could feel the aircraft struggling beneath her feet, could hear the engines working far harder than they should be, and when she saw the captain's tense expression during his walkthrough, she knew they were in serious trouble. Sarah made her first critical decision as she realized they couldn't reach their planned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. "Tower, this is Flight 447. We need to level off at 15,000 due to performance issues," she radioed, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her throat. The air traffic controller's response was immediate and professional, but Sarah could hear the concern in his voice as he cleared them to maintain 15,000 feet. Jake was running calculations on fuel consumption, and the numbers were terrifying. At their current altitude and with the engines working at maximum power, they would burn through their fuel reserves long before reaching Hawaii. "We're not going to make it to Honolulu," he told Sarah quietly, his hands shaking as he showed her the fuel projections. "We need to turn back or find an alternate airport." Sarah's mind raced through their options as she fought to keep the overloaded aircraft stable. They could return to Los Angeles, but that would mean climbing again to clear the mountains, something she wasn't sure the struggling plane could handle. They could try for Las Vegas, but that was still hours away with their current fuel burn. Every choice carried deadly risks for the 52 souls depending on her expertise. In the cabin, Emma was starting to notice that something wasn't right. The flight attendants had walked past their row multiple times, their smiles looking more forced with each pass. The engines sounded different than on any flight she had ever taken, louder and more strained, like machinery being pushed beyond its limits. "Marcus, does this plane sound normal to you?" she whispered to her husband, who was trying to hide his own growing concern. Marcus had flown dozens of times for business, and he knew that commercial aircraft weren't supposed to sound like they were fighting against the sky itself. The plane shuddered suddenly, a violent vibration that rattled the overhead bins and caused several passengers to gasp in fear. Drinks spilled, magazines slid off tray tables, and the comfortable illusion of routine air travel shattered in an instant. Jessica let out a small cry of terror and started to unbuckle her seatbelt, her panic overriding rational thought. Maria quickly moved to Jessica's side, her training taking over despite her own fear. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your seatbelt fastened," she said gently but firmly, placing a reassuring hand on Jessica's shoulder. "We're just experiencing some turbulence." But Jessica wasn't buying the explanation, and neither were the other passengers who had felt that unnatural shudder. "That wasn't turbulence," Jessica said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, her voice cracking with emotion. "Something's wrong with this plane, isn't it?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, spreading fear through the cabin. As other passengers began to voice their own concerns, Frank Morrison made his decision and quietly approached Maria, showing her his retired pilot credentials and offering his help. The relief on Maria's face was visible as she quickly escorted him to the front galley, where she explained in hushed tones that the pilots were dealing with a severe weight miscalculation. Frank's worst fears were confirmed as he realized the magnitude of the error that had put everyone's life in danger. Meanwhile, Sarah was making the hardest decision of her flying career as she watched the engine temperature gauges climb steadily toward the red zone. The aircraft was simply too heavy to maintain safe flight operations, and continuing to Hawaii was no longer an option. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Her voice came over the intercom, each word carefully chosen to inform without causing outright panic. "We're experiencing a technical issue that requires us to make an unscheduled landing. We'll be diverting to Los Angeles International Airport as a precautionary measure." The word "unscheduled" sent a chill through the cabin as passengers began to understand that their dream vacation was turning into something much more serious. Emma felt tears forming in her eyes as she thought about their hotel reservations, their planned activities, their perfect honeymoon that was slipping away. But more than that, she was beginning to fear that they might not make it to any destination at all. The aircraft lurched again, losing altitude suddenly as the engines finally began to show signs of serious strain. This time there was no hiding the severity of the situation as passengers felt their stomachs drop and saw the genuine fear in the flight attendant's eyes. Marcus pulled Emma close, whispering words of comfort that he wasn't sure he believed himself. The plane was clearly in distress, fighting against forces that seemed determined to bring it down. Jake's voice was tight with stress as he continued monitoring their fuel situation. "We're burning fuel at twice the normal rate," he told Sarah. "Even if we turn back now, it's going to be close." Sarah nodded grimly, knowing that every minute they stayed in the air brought them closer to a potential disaster. She began the complex process of requesting emergency clearance back to Los Angeles, knowing that declaring an emergency would mobilize resources, but also confirm everyone's worst fears. Frank Morrison had quietly positioned himself where he could help the flight attendants prepare for emergency procedures while trying to keep the passengers calm. His presence was reassuring to those around him, his authoritative voice and calm demeanor helping to prevent complete panic as the situation continued to deteriorate. "I've been flying for 30 years, he told a group of terrified passengers, "and I can tell you that pilots train for situations like this constantly. Our crew knows exactly what they're doing." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Frank was running his own calculations, and the numbers were frighteningly close. The aircraft would need every bit of fuel and power to make it back to Los Angeles safely. Sarah finally made the call that would change everything. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 447 declaring an emergency. We are severely overweight and unable to maintain safe flight operations. Requesting immediate vectors to Los Angeles International." The controller's response was immediate and professional, his voice betraying none of the urgency that Sarah knew he was feeling. Flight 447, roger your mayday. Turn left heading 270. Descend and maintain 10,000. Emergency services are being notified. In the cabin, the word Mayday had carried clearly through the aircraft's communication system, and the last pretense of normalcy crumbled as passengers realized they were in a genuine life-or-death situation. Emma broke down completely, sobbing into Marcus's chest as the reality hit her that they might not survive to see their first wedding anniversary. Jessica was hyperventilating, her panic attack made worse by the knowledge that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the danger that surrounded them at 10,000 feet. Other passengers were praying, crying, or sitting in stunned silence as they contemplated their mortality. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, their training taking over as they began preparing for the possibility of an emergency landing. They demonstrated safety positions, checked that seatbelts were secure, and tried to project calm confidence even as their own hearts raced with fear. Maria found herself thinking about her own family, her children who were waiting for her to come home from this trip, and she made a silent promise that she would do everything in her power to make sure everyone on board made it safely to the ground. The aircraft continued its frightening descent toward Los Angeles, not entirely by choice, but driven by the simple fact that the overworked engines could no longer maintain their previous altitude. Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls, despite the fear coursing through her veins, drawing on every hour of training and experience to keep the aircraft stable as they approached what might be the most challenging landing of her career. The air traffic controller was working frantically to clear the airspace around Los Angeles International, moving commercial flights out of their path and coordinating with emergency services on the ground. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue vehicles were racing to their positions along the runway, their crews preparing for whatever might happen when Flight 447 attempted to land. Flight 447, runway 24. Left is cleared for immediate landing. Emergency vehicles are in position. Report your fuel remaining and souls on board, came the controller's voice. We have approximately 30 minutes of fuel remaining. 52, souls on board plus crew, Sarah responded, her voice betraying just a hint of the stress she was feeling. The margin for error was becoming dangerously thin, with barely enough fuel to complete one approach and landing attempt. As the lights of Los Angeles came into view, passengers pressed their faces to the windows, seeing what they hoped would be their salvation spread out below them. The sight of the airport in the distance brought a mixture of hope and terror, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. Frank Morrison was helping the flight attendants make final preparations, his experience invaluable in ensuring that passengers understood what to expect during an emergency landing. Emma had stopped crying and was holding Marcus's hand with fierce determination, both of them preparing mentally for whatever came next. Jessica had found an unexpected reservoir of strength, helping an elderly passenger understand the safety instructions and even managing to crack a small joke to lighten the mood. The aircraft's approach was unlike anything Sarah had ever attempted, fighting the overweight plane every foot of the way down, while trying to maintain enough speed to avoid a stall, but not so much that they would overshoot the runway. The engines were still protesting, their temperature gauges dancing dangerously close to redline conditions, but they were holding together through excellent maintenance and sheer determination. Brace for impact, came the announcement over the intercom, though everyone hoped desperately that it would prove to be an unnecessary precaution. The wheels touched down hard on the runway, much harder than any passenger had ever experienced. The aircraft bouncing once before settling onto the tarmac with a tremendous screech of brakes and reverse thrust. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the plane as it rolled down the runway, their lights flashing in the darkness, but incredibly, the aircraft remained intact and under control. As Flight 447 finally came to a complete stop, the cabin erupted in cheers, tears, and applause, as 52 passengers and crew realized they had survived what could easily have been a catastrophic disaster. Sarah slumped forward in her pilot's seat, emotionally and physically exhausted but filled with pride that she had brought every single person home safely, despite the impossible circumstances they had faced. The evacuation was swift and orderly, with passengers sliding down emergency chutes onto the tarmac, where they were met by paramedics and emergency personnel. Emma and Marcus were among the first off the aircraft, embracing each other on the runway with tears of relief and gratitude. Their honeymoon forever changed, but their love for each other, stronger than ever. Jessica kissed the ground when she reached the tarmac, promising herself that she would never again take the miracle of flight for granted. Frank Morrison was the last passenger to leave, stopping to shake hands with Sarah and tell her that she had performed magnificently under the most challenging circumstances any pilot could face. The investigation that followed would reveal that a cargo loading supervisor had made a critical error in calculating weight distribution, adding nearly 8,000 pounds of excess baggage and cargo that should never have been allowed on the aircraft. It was the kind of mistake that happens rarely, but can have devastating consequences, caught only by the skill, training, and determination of a flight crew who refused to give up when everything seemed hopeless. Emma and Marcus eventually made it to their Hawaiian honeymoon 5 days later on a different airline, but they never forgot the flight that taught them how precious every moment together really was, and Sarah continued flying for another 12 years, always remembering the day she learned that sometimes the most important destination is simply making it safely home to the people who love you.